the newsagents.
In its desperation to cling on to power at all costs, the Tory party is undertaking a kind of weird McCarthyism, trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect.
So Keir Starmer talking about Senator Joe McCarthy, the McCarthy witch hunts that went on in the 1950s to root out communists from all sorts of places in American society, the film industry, from government, from wherever else. The contention of Starmer is that the Tories are pursuing culture wars against all sorts of establishment institutions to do the same. But is he right?
This is a real departure for the Labour leader, who has run a mile from all the culture war stuff previously. And we're going to analyse why he's now running towards it. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily. And if you look at how the Labour Party has tried so hard to position itself, really pretty much since Keir Starmer took over, their priorities have been very clear. Keir Starmer wore the T-shirt saying, "I'm not Jeremy Corbyn." He wanted to distance himself from the previous Labour leader. And Rachel Reeves wore a T-shirt saying, "We will not be stupid with your money. We're not out to overspend." And that was pretty much where they wanted to stay. They did not take the bait for any of the issues that the Conservative Party, particularly under Boris Johnson, I think also under Liz Truss, were throwing at them. Whether it was questions about statues and slavery, whether it was questions about education and history and what our children learned, whether it was questions about trans, they kind of wanted to just find middle ground that wasn't screaming and shouting and trying to wage war on cultural issues or identity politics in a way that they felt that certainly Boris Johnson was doing, and that most people in this country were not that interested in pursuing. And so they didn't really touch any of that stuff for a long time.
Well, the shorthand in the press, in the right-wing press, is the war on woke, and woke being the most terrible insult that you can hurl at anyone. And obviously you can all find areas where things maybe have gone too far in trying to be right on. But broadly speaking, if woke equals just being a bit more sensitive about other people's kind of views and outlook on life, then broadly not that bad a thing. But Labour have tried to stay studiously neutral. Don't stoke a culture war. Don't get involved in a culture war. But when you had the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, coming under attack as they did from Farage, for example, who said that they were acting as a taxi service for illegal immigrants, possibly one of his more egregious comments.
No, not even close. I mean, not even. No, sorry. I'm just going to pick you on that. It wasn't even in the top 100 most egregious thing that Farage has ever said. But I'm going to let you continue now. Go on.
Thank you for letting me continue. But the idea that an organisation that had had the Queen as its patron for 70 years should just go past a drowning man or woman or child having fallen out of a useless inflatable boat and let them drown would have been absolutely horrifying. And the idea that Farage was actually advocating that so that they weren't acting as a taxi service and picking drowning men and women and children up in the middle of the channel was just monstrous. And others were picking those sort of things up and saying, oh, the RNLI, too bloody woke by half.
Well, what's interesting is that I guess the public speaks with its own voice on a lot of these issues. And after Farage accused the RNLI of being a taxi service, donations to the RNLI massively increased. I think people felt that any body that was helping to save drowning people should be supported, and the people of Britain are kind-hearted and just kind enough, quite frankly, to want the bodies that help us to be helped by us. And another example of this was the National Trust. Now, I could not point to the moment where the National Trust sort of stopped being like the most boring news story in the sort of back of the culture pages because it was about some garden opening, and became the thing that was getting people so angry that they actually had to go out and try and remove the board of people sitting on the National Trust and replace them with people who were more kind of like-minded. And what was the crime of the National Trust? I guess the crime of the National Trust was to start putting the properties, the houses, the castles, the gardens that it owns in some kind of historic context for people visiting, to say whether it was built as a product of slave money, whether it was built as a product of colonialism. I mean, not to the exclusion of everything else. They still do, let me assure you, the cream teas. They still do the blue delphiniums. They still have long passages about the kind of chintz used. But they also try and just put for people visiting a sense of where these properties came from and how they were sort of accrued, and they tell you a little bit more about history, which you would have thought was quite a good thing, right? Particularly if you're a Conservative and you like conserving things. I'd love to conserve this. Explain to me, what it's all about. But no, this created an absolute barnstorm for people who felt that the National Trust had fallen by the way of the radical left.
Yeah. When I was in Washington, Mount Vernon is where George Washington used to live, and the national monuments and the National Park Service in the US is absolutely a jewel in the crown. And at Mount Vernon, you get a headset to guide you round the place where Washington lived and planned the Revolutionary Wars and American independence and all the rest of it. You could also have a different setting where you could have the slave's eye view of Mount Vernon, of where they worked, the fires that had to be kept 24/7 because this was what the greenhouse and the exotic plants were, and how the slaves lived as well at Mount Vernon. And it was a fascinating piece of history. Nobody said, oh my God, this is woke. This is just telling you about how Americans lived then and how slaves lived then. And that is what the National Trust wanted to do in terms of making people more aware that, maybe this great estate was built off the back of, slave owning plantations and all the rest of it in the Caribbean. And that doesn't seem to me being woke. That seems to me about making people aware of history. And it's not rewriting history. It is not doing people down, but people felt really threatened by it. And the culture wars stuff that we have seen so much of in America, whether it be over abortion, whether it be over gun rights, whether it be over a kind of Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it, hadn't really been a part of British life. And yet you just felt this was being imported, that there were new areas that Britain could have its own culture wars over. And that is something that Keir Starmer has been trying to address today.
Before we go on, let's just play you the bit where he's talking in the speech about the Royal National Lifeboat Institute and about the National Trust.
An organisation the late Queen was patron of for 70 years to find real solutions to stop the small boats. Their rhetoric has helped demonise them. Instead of working with the National Trust so more people can learn about and celebrate the culture and our history, they've managed to demean their work. Let me tell you, waging a war on the proud spirit of service in this country isn't leadership. It's desperate, it's divisive, it's damaging. And it comes to something when the Tories are at war with the National Trust. That's what happens when politics of self-preservation prevail over commitment to service.
So, interestingly, the Spectator has picked up on the remarks by Starmer. And the Spectator, Harry Mount, has said he wants to attract the middle ground by attacking the supposedly crusty traditional wing. Which is very interesting because I think the people that have attacked the sort of traditional wing, weirdly, you could argue, is the Conservatives who have tried to make an enemy of what the National Trust is doing. And Harry Mount says the Trust used to be a byword for high-minded thought with an eye for fine aesthetic presentation, exceptional country houses, but over those last 2 decades there's been a catastrophic intellectual decline. Captions in displays have appalling spelling and grammatical mistakes. Facts are dispensed in favour of dim, kiddie-friendly opinions. So I think he's saying it's fine to talk about slavery, but get your facts right. Now, I'm pretty sure that Keir Starmer wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think he'd also say, get your captions right. But that seems an odd response to what Keir Starmer is saying today. I think if you look at electorally in a really crude sense, the National Trust is where Middle England goes. It's what they do. It's what they love. And Keir Starmer said, great, if you don't want them, if you're going to piss off all those people that are, part of the National Trust and believe in the National Trust and adore the National Trust, yeah, I'll speak to them, we'll have them. And so it seems to me that Keir Starmer is actually now jumping onto pretty vacant ground because these institutions have become the centre of Conservative attacks. And it's not very far to go from the National Trust to the civil service, to the judiciary, to the kinds of places that we constantly see come under attack by these successive prime ministers.
Look, I want to take you back to another prime minister, to Tony Blair in July 2000. And he felt that he judged the mood of the British people brilliantly. And he wanted to be the voice of Middle Britain. And where did he go? The Women's Institute.
Oh, you've just watched that episode of The Crown.
I have watched that episode of The Crown, but I remember it vividly. And the shock that they felt in Downing Street, that Blair had got slow hand clapped when he spoke to the Women's Institute and tried to kind of give them a more up to date, and he was kind of very Tony Blair in that early era of bright eyed and kind of full of ideological zeal and wishing to please everybody, and he got it badly wrong. I think for Keir Starmer politically to ally himself with the National Trust and the RNLI is a risk-free option for him when so many people, it'd be like saying, I support the RSPB. I like bird watching or whatever it happens to be. Those are Middle England, Middle Britain pursuits. And I think that for him to identify that maybe that territory has been abandoned is bold and sensible for him to do it.
OK, so going back to Tony Blair, I'd say that funnily enough, the Women's Institute response to Tony Blair for talking about politics is what Rishi Sunak feels is the place of the National Trust and people now, that actually people don't want to have politics thrown in to their, exceptional country houses. They don't want to have politics thrown in to their, rescue service, their lifeboat service. The question is, what is politics, right? Is politics rescuing people no matter whether they're immigrants or not? Or is politics rescuing immigrants because that puts you on the side of immigrants? Do you see what I mean? It's a very complicated place to say, oh, we've got to depoliticise these places, because you can argue that either way, I think.
Well, I think that one of the, the feats of the culture wars as waged in America is you create false opposites.
Yeah.
You just create a schism between two groups of people where there can be no common ground. And the idea that the National Trust has to stay fossilised and just say, oh, aren't these gardens magnificent, and not talk about how they were originally planted or how their money came by to plant these amazing gardens dug by Capability Brown or whoever it happened to be, you are not doing a real service. And I also think that, what we saw, particularly at the end of the Johnson era, and Jacob Rees-Mogg telling civil servants that they were the blob and that they had to go back to work and there was no excuse for them working from home, etc., etc., etc. You were trying to turn the civil service into an enemy.
Yeah.
When the Daily Mail started talking about judges being enemies of the people, you are trying to pull down your own institutions to serve a culture war end. Now, whether Keir Starmer has got it absolutely right over this or not, there are plenty of examples around where you do sense that actually polarising and creating false opposites is part of the Tory strategy, because understandably, when you're 20 points behind and nothing seems to be working, you throw whatever you can at the wall, and it tends to get uglier and uglier the more desperate you become.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what Keir Starmer is doing, or has done today, is take us into ground that we are going to see more of. And I don't mean about sort of, taking on the woke or even entering sort of the culture wars. I mean finding the sort of pockets of people that possibly feels slightly abandoned. And I think you can see what he's now doing, for example, towards farmers, right? Which is not a traditional Labour constituency. When has, you know, the sort of inner city, the metropolitan Labour Party kind of ever vocally cared about what was happening in the shires, right? That's not sort of the traditional
And the Labour Party
priority.
lost huge support with the ban on hunting and the money it took from the anti-hunting group. And, you know, the Countryside Alliance grew up
Remember
strong.
the marches in London?
Yeah.
It was the neatest, tidiest march that London's ever seen. I think they took all their litter home with them, you know. But I think now you'll see Keir Starmer saying, right, you know, I'm not resting on my laurels. I don't believe in the 19, 20 point, 30 point lead in the polls. I'm going to go after all these places that are actually feeling slightly forgotten. But I think we will see over coming weeks him sort of establish this bi-weekly address to a group of people that he hasn't particularly talked to before, that Labour hasn't particularly addressed before. And I suppose you could broadly call it the national anthem strategy, which is, you know, stop being terrified of England or Britain or Middle England or just the sort of middle of the road stuff that most people quite like. And I think we're going to see a very different kind of message emerging now, which is pretty much part of where Labour think the new territory, the new gains are going to come from.
Well, where the new territory has been abandoned. There was a bit, it was interesting, the kind of coincidence of these things, that, you know, Keir Starmer was making this speech today as the culture secretary, was not quite starting a culture war, but she was going over territory where Conservatives tend to go to when they want to pick a fight, and that was, with our former employer, the BBC. And Lucy Fraser went on Sky because there are some new Ofcom rules, which means that the BBC websites, the BBC news sites are now going to come under Ofcom sort of supervision. And she was asked by Kay Burley on Sky News, is the BBC biased?
What we've heard from audience is that some people think it's biased. Some people think that their complaints aren't heard. Well, what I've looked at is the evidence, and the evidence from Ofcom is that 39% of complaints last year were in relation to impartiality, whereas the previous year they were 19%. So there is a perception amongst audiences that
but
the BBC
perception isn't necessarily reality.
Well, there are only perceptions, and perceptions are important. What's important about the BBC is that it's funded by the public. So the perceptions of audiences, of the public, are important.
So Lucy Fraser there saying, we have evidence of the perception, which is not quite the same as saying we have evidence of bias. And it was kind of notable that she's sitting there as a well-briefed cabinet minister, her notes in front of her, asked for evidence of BBC bias, and the answer was pretty thin.
OK, I'm going to use the hungry dog argument. If you ask a dog if it's hungry, your dog always says, I'm hungry, right? Dogs notoriously are always hungry. I think politicians have pretty much the same relationship with an institution that is meant to hold them in check. That's normal.
Yes, and just on your hungry dog metaphor, yeah, my dog Alfie will eat any scrap of filthy chicken bone that has been left on the street, and you have to fish it out of his mouth because he's going to choke on it otherwise. But I also think that politicians also like to feed bits of the right-wing press who they know are temperamentally antithetical to the BBC and other cultural organisations, and it's an easy headline. And so, you know, you get Keir Starmer doing a speech like that, which is quite a sane speech about the National Trust and the denigration of national institutions, and you get a headline in the Daily Telegraph saying Sir Keir Starmer defends woke agenda at the National Trust. Now, that's not what he was defending, a woke agenda. He was saying stop bringing these people into the middle of these culture wars. And I'm sure that Lucy Fraser will attract similar headlines for having tried to tame the BBC, that left-wing monster. Now, you and I don't want to get into a whole conversation about impartiality at the BBC. You and I have had that conversation plenty, and some of it on this podcast as well. But it is just about the big institutions being seen as ripe for getting easy headlines, to stoke your base, to make them feel good.
I think that's right. And I think, to your point in the Telegraph, you know, the Times is running Lucy Fraser's interview with the line, Culture Secretary accuses the BBC of bias. And it says audiences increasingly felt the corporation was failing to be impartial. Now, is the Times running that because they are questioning whether it's true, or are the Times running it because they are obviously a commercial rival to the BBC and it serves their purposes to repeat a headline that the accusation is coming from the government that the BBC is biased? I mean, these things sort of need a lot of unpicking, but they basically all feed into the same place, which is, I don't hear the Culture Secretary questioning the bias of any other media organisation, right? Only the BBC, because the BBC is funded by the public.
But the other broadcasting organisations are under the same regulatory requirements as the BBC. It's not like one is a commercial organisation, therefore it can do what it's like, and the other is funded by the licence payer. They have the same obligations, ITV, yes, Sky, and yes, GB News as well as the BBC.
Yes. Sorry, Culture Secretary, is there any problem with impartiality at the station that employs many of your colleagues within the Conservative Party, including sitting MPs and former ministers?
We know, Emily, we know the answer to that. Liz Truss told us that GB News is where you go to find out the truth, because you can't find it on the BBC.
Or where you go to after you've left the government.
All job applications welcome from ex-Tory ministers.
We'll be back off the break. Right, you're now going to need to get your popcorn out, because we're going to tell you about PopCon.
God, I'm glad you enunciated that clearly, because it sounds like, get the popcorn out because we're going to talk about popcorn.
Popular conservatism.
Ah.
Not to be confused with new conservatism or Conservative Democrats or the climate change conservatives or the low carbon conservatives. This is a brand new grouping. Brand new,
wow.
Yeah, grouping.
They've got more varieties than Heinz, haven't they?
Yeah, they're on a Baskin-Robbins sort of spread trajectory. It's Liz Truss. It is Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, wow.
It is the newly departed Simon Clarke, who we were speaking to in this studio just last week. And they've decided it's time for the Conservatives to have
PopCon.
Popular conservatism. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look at the polls, you could see that there is a demand for popular conservatism as opposed to unpopular conservatism, because we do seem to have an awful lot of unpopular conservatism. But how does this group distinguish itself from some of the other, I'm not going to use the five families phrase because we can't use that anymore, but I mean, well, we can, but I'm not going to. Well, I just have. But how does it distinguish itself from other right-wing groupings?
I'm glad you asked. Well, its aim is to restore democratic accountability to Britain and deliver popular Conservative policies, as opposed to, as you said, unpopular Conservative policies, which I guess, if the polls are right, most of them are. Now, I was speaking to one pretty senior Conservative who said just renting a room and downloading a logo doesn't actually make you a brand new party. And their point was that they, I think, speak to pretty much all their colleagues, you know, on a sort of weekly basis. They get around. They said, Emily, you're the first person who's told me about this, right? First person who's told them about
you're either
PopCon.
Breaking, this is important, because you're either breaking an earth-shattering exclusive,
yeah, exactly,
or
it's
they might
anywhere.
be insignificant.
Yeah. And I guess what it tells you, as if we need reminding, is that Liz Truss has definitely not given up the ghost, right? She does not feel chastened, humbled, dare I say, humiliated by her experience in 2022. If anything, she is back resurgent, because I guess if there's one person that vindicates how terrible you were, it's the sense of how the next person is doing. I'm pretty sure that people shut up about Theresa May as soon as Boris Johnson came into government, because everything became so much worse under him. And I'm pretty sure that then people shut up about Boris Johnson when everything became so much worse under Liz Truss. And then Liz Truss left on a sort of steam of, you know, blue smoke. And Rishi Sunak hasn't actually been able to pick up the pieces from the person that was then being called the worst Prime Minister the country's ever seen. His personal popularity ratings are dire at the moment. And I suppose this speaks to the fact that Liz Truss thinks, I don't know, there is a way back, if not for her in a leadership role, at least for the policies she espoused.
Yeah, look, I sort of admire the resilience of certain people in politics and the way they are able to carry on. I mean, I kind of thought, how Theresa May lasted 3 years, for example, with her premiership, given everything that was happening and the Commons defeats and all the rest of it. And, and Theresa May was still this dignified presence. Good luck to Liz Truss if she thinks there's a way back from what she did. I'm interested as well, because we spent a lot of last week talking about Rwanda and boats, about the fact that apparently the chief whip is calling in the Tory rebels who voted against the government. And I kind of think, well, is it for a dressing down? Is it to be warned that if they do anything like that again, they'll be kicked out of the Conservative Party? I can see why you would want to do it, but I also can understand how if they are called in and there is no action, then actually far from making Rishi Sunak look strong and tough, it can make him look weaker, because I don't know what sanction Rishi Sunak has got at the moment to do anything about those rebels.
Okay, unless you spin it round and you say maybe this has nothing to do with Rishi Sunak, right? Maybe it's not to do with castigation, it's not to do with punishment, it's actually more to do with other Conservative colleagues who are saying, actually, these guys, these people are making our lives really hard, right? We're trying to fight seats against the Lib Dems in the southwest. We're trying to fight seats, in the Red Wall. We're trying to explain our policies more broadly. And the rebels are actually making everyone else's job harder. And so I wonder whether it has less to do with sort of punitive measures and more to do with a kind of like spelling out a sense of collegiate responsibility, I suppose, to other people whose, chances they might be making worse.
And we discussed on the podcast last week, Isaac Levido, the chief election strategist, going to Tory MPs and telling them, look, you carry on fighting each other, you've lost the next election. But you do start to wonder whether actually it is in the interests of some Conservative MPs who have got ambitions for leadership that Rishi Sunak does lose the next election.
Interesting thought on that bombshell. We will be back in a second.
I'm sure you're probably tuning into the newsagents and wondering, where is the news about Ron de Santis pulling out of the race in the US for the presidential nomination? Well, we have got a whole special bonus episode of Newsagents USA where we're going to dig into the culture wars and the culture wars he tried to stoke but ultimately lost, and how he is now bending the knee once again to Donald Trump, another person who has surrendered and waved the white flag.
We've called it Ron de Santis, Ron over, car crash, run over. We've called it Rod and Gone. Anyway, you can find us on the Newsagents.
You really
USA.
should have been a sub-editor for the Sun newspaper, shouldn't you?
Hallmark gift cards. That's what I do best.
Hallmark gift cards.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
you can't do cheesy though. You're not very good.
No, I can't.
No, that would be that's maybe
it's quite depressing
about things.
I know.
No way.
Anyway, you can find that entire episode just for you on Newsagents USA, which is on a separate feed called the Newsagents USA.
Is that the Newsagents USA?
It is the Newsagents USA.
We'll be back tomorrow. See you then. Bye.
See you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.